There is a scene near the end of Muscle Man's wedding, deep in Regular Show's sixth season, where a blue jay in a rented jacket stands up in front of a room full of people who love him and tries to say something true out loud for maybe the first time in his adult life, and he gets exactly 2 sentences into it before the girl he is trying to say it to cuts him off, stands up, and walks out into the parking lot alone. Rain does not fall in that scene. It doesn't need to. Everyone in the room already knows what she is and what she becomes when something breaks in her, and for a second you can feel the whole wedding hold its breath, waiting to see if the sky is going to follow her out the door. It doesn't. That day. She just leaves, and somewhere in the years since that episode aired, a strange thing happened to the character who walked out of that room. She became the one person in the entire cast of Regular Show that fans still cannot agree on. Not Rigby, who spent the better part of a decade refusing to grow up. Not Benson, who screamed at his employees so often it became a kind of punctuation for the whole series. Her, CJ, the Cloud Girl, the Storm. If you were not deep in the fandom while the show was airing, you might not know that this is even a debate. CJ shows up in the back half of the run, dates Mordecai for a while, has a temper that occasionally becomes a literal weather event, and then fades out of the story without much fanfare. That is the version you get if you watch the show once, casually, the way most people watch things. But sit in the comment sections long enough, read enough old forum threads, scroll through enough Tumblr tags with names like controversial characters that exist specifically because someone decided she belonged in that category, and a different picture starts to take shape. People have written essays defending her. People have written essays about how she deserved better. People have built entire debate threads around a single question that never quite resolves. Was CJ badly written, or was CJ the only character on the show honest enough about her feelings to get punished for having them? That question is what this is about. Not a takedown, not a defense either, not really, though by the end you will probably be able to guess where the evidence leans. This is something closer to an excavation. We are going to start at the surface with the version of CJ that most people remember, the tantrums and the thunderclouds and the wedding she nearly ruined, and then we are going to go down layer by layer into the parts of her story that get left out of the arguments about her. The episode where we learn exactly why she is the way she is. The episode where the show, very quietly, tells you that the person who started the whole mess might not have been her at all. The strange, sad detail buried in a creator interview about what actually happens to her after the story stops paying attention. And underneath all of it, a question that has nothing to do with Regular Show specifically, and everything to do with the way audiences decide, almost without noticing they're deciding, which characters get to be angry and which characters get called unhinged for feeling the exact same thing. Before we get into any of that, if you're the kind of person who watches these late at night, in bed, half gone already, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I like knowing that. It's a strange, quiet kind of company, knowing that somewhere out there, someone is lying in the dark with this playing while their part of the world has already gone to sleep around them. All right, let's go back to the beginning. The character who eventually becomes the center of all this controversy does not arrive in regular show as a storm. She arrives as a joke about heartbreak that the writers clearly did not expect to matter as much as it ended up mattering. It happens in season 3 in an episode called Yes, Dude, Yes. The setup is almost embarrassingly simple. Mordecai, the blue jay who works as a groundskeeper at the park alongside his best friend Rigby, sees what looks like Margaret, the coffee shop worker he has been quietly in love with for the entire run of the show up to that point, accepting a marriage proposal. He does not know the full context. He does not ask for it. He just absorbs the blow, the way people do when they are 20-something and heartbroken and too embarrassed to ask the follow-up question that would clear everything up. And because this is still fairly early regular show, the way he processes that heartbreak is not through a long conversation with a friend or a period of quiet reflection. It's through Rigby helping him build an online dating profile that describes him with the kind of accuracy that only a best friend willing to humiliate you can provide, as someone who enjoys video games, goofing off, and grilled cheese. That profile is how he meets CJ. And what's easy to miss if you're watching for the first time or watching casually the second or third time is that the entire dynamic that will eventually define their relationship, the confusion, the crossed signals, the sense that one of them is always a half step ahead of the other in figuring out what they actually want, is present from the very first conversation. Mordecai is not looking for CJ specifically. He's looking for a distraction from Margaret, dressed up as a fresh start. CJ, for her part, is a cloud humanoid, pale-skinned, dark-haired, laid back in a way that reads as effortlessly cool next to Mordecai's nervous energy, and she and Mordecai discover almost immediately that they like the same things. Video games, music, the particular specific brand of goofing off that the whole show is built around. It's the kind of instant compatibility that romantic comedies use as a shortcut. Two people who fit together because the writers need them to fit together quickly, and for a while it works exactly the way it's supposed to. They spend time together. They get along. It's easy. And then Margaret comes back into the picture, the way exes do, the way half-resolved feelings do, and Mordecai, without any real malice, without even fully realizing he's doing it, starts sending CJ a set of signals that do not match the ones he'd been sending a week earlier. He is not lying to her exactly. He is doing something more common and in some ways more damaging than lying, which is failing to be honest with himself quickly enough to be honest with someone else. CJ notices. Of course she notices. And by the end of that very first episode, the one where she is introduced, the one where the show is technically just setting up a side character for a season or two of will they, won't they, she is the one who has to stop and confront him about it. She is the one who has to say, out loud, effectively for the first time in the whole series, that something about how he's behaving toward her does not add up. Sit with that for a second, because it matters more than it looks like it matters. The character who would eventually be remembered, rightly or wrongly, as the difficult one, the volatile one, the one fans argue about, enters the story by being the person clear-eyed enough to name a problem that the male lead himself hadn't worked up the nerve to name. That's not a minor detail buried in a wiki entry. That's the origin point. Before she ever produces a single drop of rain on screen, before the word controversial ever gets attached to her in a comment section, CJ's very first characterizing act in regular show is honesty. Uncomfortable, unglamorous, unrewarded honesty, delivered to a guy who was not ready to hear it. It would be easy, and more than a little unfair, to overcorrect here and paint her as a flawless character who did nothing wrong and was simply misunderstood by an unfair fandom. That's not quite it either, and we'll get to the parts of her arc that genuinely do complicate that reading, the moments where her anger stops being righteous and starts being something closer to frightening, the moments where the show itself seems unsure, whether it's asking you to sympathize with her or recoil from her. Those moments are real, and they deserve to be taken seriously rather than explained away. But the origin matters because it sets the terms of everything that follows. CJ does not enter this story as a chaos agent. She enters it as someone paying closer attention to the truth of a situation than the person she's dating. And then, for the rest of her run on the show, the narrative keeps circling back to variations on that same dynamic. CJ noticing something is wrong, CJ naming it, and the fandom watching from outside the story, somehow deciding that she is the problem. That gap between what she actually does in the text and what she gets blamed for in the reaction to the text is the first real crack in the surface. It's worth pausing on it before we go any deeper, because it's the crack that everything else in this video is going to widen. Most casual viewers remember CJ as the girlfriend who got scary when she was upset. Fewer remember that the first thing we ever see her do is hold a boy accountable for not being honest with her. Both of those things are true. The show never asks you to forget the second one in order to focus on the first. Fans mostly did that work themselves. What follows her introduction across the back half of Season 3 and deep into Season 5 is a slow-motion courtship that the show takes surprisingly seriously for a series built on cosmic monsters and video game tournaments. There's an episode called New Year's Kiss set at a masquerade party where the two of them, half disguised, share a kiss without either of them fully certain who's underneath the other person's mask, a detail that plays as a joke in the moment, but reads, in hindsight, as a kind of quiet metaphor for the entire relationship. They are drawn to each other honestly. They are also, for a long stretch of time, not entirely sure what they're looking at when they look at each other. There's an episode called Dodge This, where the aftermath of that kiss gets awkward enough that they agree, in the practical, slightly embarrassed way that people in their 20s agree to these things, to just stay friends, an arrangement that lasts exactly as long as those arrangements usually last. There's an episode called I Like You High, where Mordecai, finally, after seasons of near misses with Margaret and false starts with CJ, says the thing plainly. And there's an episode called Real Date, where they exchange charm bracelets and become, officially, a couple, the show marking the occasion with the kind of small, sincere tenderness it reserves for its most important relationship beats. What's striking, watching this stretch of episodes back with the later controversy in mind, is how little friction there is. This is not, in its early seasons, a relationship defined by explosions. It's defined by two people who like the same music and the same games and have found, almost by accident, a version of companionship that feels lower stakes and more comfortable than anything Mordecai had with Margaret, precisely because it isn't loaded down with years of longing and missed timing. CJ, in this stretch, is witty. She's independent. She's good at things, genuinely good, not sitcom good, in ways the show takes time to establish. She's a formidable dodgeball player, good enough to play for a team called the Thunder Girls. She rides a motorcycle with the kind of ease that suggests it long predates the show's decision to put a camera on her doing it. And she is, in her own understated way, one of the more competent people in a cast full of people who are gently, extremely bad at their jobs. None of that is the version of her that gets argued about online. The version that gets argued about online starts a little later, once the relationship has enough history behind it to start accumulating wounds. And to understand where those wounds come from and whether they're evidence of a badly written character or a well-written one who simply makes people uncomfortable, you have to go down another layer into the one episode that the show uses to explain, as directly as it ever explains anything about her, why CJ is built the way she's built. That's where we're headed next. But it's worth carrying this first layer with you as we go deeper. Everyone remembers the storm. Almost nobody remembers that the very first thing she ever did, before there was a storm to remember, was tell the truth. Before we go any further down, it's worth being precise about what the storm actually is, because the show is oddly literal about it in a way that gets flattened every time someone summarizes CJ in a single sentence online. She is not a girl who is compared to a storm. She is not a girl who has stormy moods, the way that phrase gets used about 100 other characters in 100 other shows as a soft metaphor for being moody or difficult. She is a cloud. That is her body. On a calm day, she looks mostly human, pale-skinned, dark-haired, dressed like she just walked out of a garage full of instruments and skateboards, and the show lets you forget, for episodes at a stretch, that there is anything unusual about her at all. But when something genuinely upsets her, the metaphor stops being a metaphor. Her skin shifts toward a dark, storm cloud gray edged in red. The temperature in the room seems to drop. And if the feeling is big enough, if the hurt or the fury underneath it is big enough, she stops looking like a person having an emotion and starts looking like an actual meteorological event, capable of producing lightning, driving rain, and wind strong enough to flatten a food court. This is, on its face, one of the more inventive pieces of character design in the entire show, and it's worth saying plainly that it's also, on its face, one of the more dangerous. A being who can turn into a genuine natural disaster when she's upset is not a small narrative choice. It raises the stakes of every fight she has with Mordecai in a way that a fight between two ordinary 20-somethings never would be raised. When CJ gets angry, things can actually get destroyed. People can actually get hurt or come close to it. And this is, I think, the single biggest reason the discourse around her ever got as heated as it did, because the writers gave her a superpower that makes her internal weather externally, physically consequential, and then asked the audience to keep sympathizing with her anyway, every time that power got used in anger. That's a hard needle to thread. Some fans think the show threaded it. Some fans think it never really did. Both positions are defensible, and we'll sit with both before this is over. But here's the layer underneath that one, the part that doesn't show up if you only remember the destructive episodes and skip the quieter ones. The show does eventually tell you where that storm comes from, and it does it with more care than almost any other piece of backstory in the entire series gets. The episode is called Daddy Issues, and it lands in season 6, well into the relationship, once the audience has already had time to form an opinion of her one way or the other. It introduces CJ's father, a professional miniature golfer named Carl Putter, and it does something the show rarely does with any of its supporting characters. It gives a grown woman's temper an actual, specific human origin, instead of just treating it as a fixed trait she showed up with. The details matter here, so let's sit with them rather than summarizing past them. Carl Putter is not a monster in any cartoonish sense. He's not abusive in the way that word gets used for the most extreme cases. What he is a father who pushed his daughter hard, competitively, in a sport that demands the kind of composure CJ has spent her whole life struggling to hold on to, and who, somewhere along the way, left her with a wound specifically shaped like miniature golf. The show stages their reunion as a rematch. CJ, as an adult, goes head-to-head with the father who trained her and, in whatever way the show leaves mostly implied rather than fully spelled out, damaged her relationship with the sport and with her own confidence in the process. She wins, and the win is not framed as a cute little side quest resolved in 22 minutes. It's framed as something closer to exorcism. She beats her father at the exact thing he used, deliberately or not, to make her feel small, and in doing so she earns something the show has been quietly implying she never fully had from him before: his open, unqualified respect. Once you've seen that episode, it becomes very hard to watch her storms the same way again. Not because it excuses the destruction, not because a difficult childhood is a blank check for scaring the people you love, but because it recontextualizes what you're actually looking at when CJ loses control. This is not a character who is randomly volatile because volatility makes for a funny bit. This is a character whose emotional regulation was shaped specifically and traceably by a competitive parent who taught her, whether he meant to or not, that failing to hold it together in front of people who mattered was itself a kind of failure. Every time CJ's skin goes gray and the wind starts picking up in the background of a scene, Daddy Issues is quietly sitting underneath it, whether the episode says so out loud or not. The show does not connect those dots for you in block letters. It trusts you to have watched carefully enough to connect them yourself. That is, I think, a labeled interpretation rather than a hard, confirmed fact, since the show never has another character say the words, "Her father is why she gets like this." But it is an interpretation the text goes out of its way to make available, and it is one that a meaningful number of longtime viewers have arrived at independently which is usually a decent sign that the writers built the connection on purpose rather than by accident. It's worth sitting, too, with the parts of her personality that exist entirely outside the storm, because the loudest arguments about CJ tend to crowd out how much of her actual screen time has nothing to do with anger at all. There's an episode called Portable Toilet, where she and Eileen, the mole who eventually becomes Rigby's wife, end up stranded together and have to work as a team to rescue Mordecai and Rigby from a situation entirely of the boys' own making. And what comes through in that episode is not volatility. It's competence and dry humor and a kind of easy warmth toward another woman that the show doesn't often give its female characters room to have with each other. CJ and Eileen become genuinely close over the course of the series, not because the plot requires it, but because the writers seem to like the idea of the two of them as friends independent of who either of them is dating. That friendship survives things that CJ's romantic relationship does not survive, which tells you something about which parts of her personality were built to last, and which parts were only ever going to hold up under the specific, unusual pressure of dating Mordecai. And that's really the shape of the deeper layer we've reached here. On the surface, CJ is the storm. One level down, she's the girl who told the truth first. One level down from that, she's the daughter of a man who taught her, competitively and maybe without meaning to, that her feelings needed to be won or lost like a match, and who she eventually beat at his own game to prove she was more than what he'd made of her. None of that erases what happens next in her story, the parts of the relationship that get genuinely harder to defend, the destruction that isn't just implied, but shown in real time on screen. But it changes the register you're watching it in. You're not watching a cartoon character malfunction for a laugh anymore. You're watching someone who was taught, young, by someone who loved her in his own limited way, that composure was the price of being taken seriously. Try and fail, and try again to hold that composure with a boyfriend who kept giving her reasons to lose it. Which brings us, gently, to where things actually start to go wrong. The turn happens around Christmas in an episode called Merry Christmas, Mordecai, and it happens in a way that is worth describing plainly, because the plain version of it is more damning of Mordecai than most casual summaries of the relationship tend to admit. CJ, at this point, is his girlfriend, not his almost girlfriend, not a situationship the show is still deciding whether to commit to, an actual, established, months-deep relationship, the kind with charm bracelets and holidays spent together. And in the middle of that relationship, she discovers Mordecai and Margaret kissing, not flirting, not exchanging a loaded look across a coffee counter, kissing in the kind of moment that leaves nothing open to interpretation at a point when Margaret is technically still someone else's, and Mordecai is technically, unambiguously, CJ's. It is worth pausing on how rarely this gets mentioned when people build the case against CJ's temper. The single most destabilizing thing that happens over the entire course of her relationship with Mordecai is not something she does. It's something he does to her in a fairly straightforward, old-fashioned, nothing ambiguous about it way. He cheats, or comes close enough to it, that the distinction barely matters to the person standing there watching it happen. And the show does not soften this. It does not give him a clever excuse or stage the moment so that it reads as an innocent misunderstanding. It shows you a girlfriend discovering, in real time, with her own eyes, that the person she trusted was doing exactly the thing she had learned, the very first time they ever spoke, to watch out for in him. Her reaction in that episode is heartbreak first and anger second, which is itself worth noticing, because so much of the discourse around her assumes the order is reversed, that she goes straight to fury, skips the hurt entirely, that she's a character built to explode, rather than a character who explodes because something underneath the explosion has been badly hurt. What follows in the episode called Sad Sacks that resolves the Christmas fallout is Mordecai doing something the show doesn't let him do nearly often enough across its run, apologizing plainly and meaning it, and CJ, after making him sit with the consequences for a while, accepting that apology and giving the relationship another chance. That reconciliation is not framed as her being a pushover. It's framed, gently, as an act of generosity. She had a clean, uncomplicated reason to walk away from him entirely at Christmas, and she didn't take it. She stayed, and she gave him another shot, near the holiday, in the specific kind of scene the show reserves for its sincerest, emotional beats. If the story had ended there, with the Christmas betrayal forgiven and the relationship steadied, CJ's reputation in the fandom might look very different today. But regular show does not let its relationships settle into anything stable for long, and the next major beat involving CJ is the one that fans point to most often when they're building the case that she was, at minimum, difficult to be with, and at worst, something closer to frightening. It happens at a party celebrating the 1,000th flight of the park's golf cart, an episode with the deliberately mundane title 1000th Chopper Flight Party, and it is, without much competition, the single most destructive thing CJ does across the entire series. The mechanics of what triggers it matter because they tell you something about the pattern the show keeps returning to with her. It is not a random flare-up. It's a misunderstanding, the kind that could plausibly be cleared up in 30 seconds of honest conversation, the kind Mordecai has now generated more than once in this relationship through a mix of poor communication and bad timing. CJ misreads an interaction between Mordecai and Margaret at the party, the old wound from Christmas still close enough to the surface that it doesn't take much to reopen it. And this time, the misread doesn't stay contained to a private, human-scaled hurt feeling the way it might for anyone else in the cast. It becomes weather, real, physical, structure-damaging weather, tearing through a party full of people who did nothing to deserve being caught inside it. This is the episode that gets cited again and again by the side of the fandom that finds CJ genuinely hard to root for, and it's worth taking that position seriously rather than waving it away, because the argument underneath it is not unreasonable. Whatever sympathetic backstory the show has given her, whatever legitimate grievances she's accumulated against Mordecai by this point in the relationship, there is a real and uncomfortable gap between having your feelings hurt and endangering a room full of bystanders because of it. A human girlfriend who got upset and started screaming at a party would be read correctly as someone struggling with anger in a way that needed addressing. A girlfriend whose anger comes with actual lightning attached raises the stakes of that same struggle into something the show sometimes seems to want to have both ways, treating it as a punchline in one beat and something to be genuinely worried about in the next. The kindest reading available, and it is a reading rather than a settled fact, since the show never states it outright, is that this is the show being honest about what unresolved trauma actually does to people, dressed up in the visual language of a Monster of the Week cartoon. CJ was never taught, by the one parent we've actually met, how to sit inside a big feeling without it needing to go somewhere immediately and visibly. Her father trained her competitively in a sport built entirely around composure, and the show has already shown us, in Daddy Issues, that this training left a mark rather than a strength. Read that way, the storm at the golf cart party is not a random cartoon superpower going off for laughs. It's a grown woman without the tools to regulate an old wound getting reopened in public in front of the exact person who reopened it the first time, and having no model for what to do with that except let it become bigger than the room. That reading does not make the destruction less real. It does contextualize it as something closer to a symptom than a character flaw invented purely to make her unlikable. Both of those readings exist in the fandom, sometimes in the same person, sometimes in the same conversation, flipping back and forth depending on which episode someone rewatched most recently. And it's that tension, unresolved, sitting right at the center of the character that keeps her showing up in most controversial conversations years after the show ended. She is not controversial because she's poorly written. She's controversial because she's written with just enough psychological texture that the audience can't fully agree on whether to blame her or grieve for her, and shows aimed at a general audience rarely leave that particular question so genuinely open. All of which sets up the episode that produced the single most argued about scene in her entire arc, dumped at the altar, set at Muscle Man's wedding, the scene this whole exploration opened with. By this point in the show's run, the relationship between CJ and Mordecai has survived a near-cheating scandal, a party-destroying storm, and the ordinary accumulated wear of two people who love each other without ever quite managing to communicate at the same speed. At the wedding, surrounded by a room full of people watching Muscle Man marry Starla, someone gives a speech about soulmates, about knowing, with total certainty, who the right person is. And something in that speech lands wrong for CJ. Maybe it's the accumulated weight of every unresolved doubt she's ever had about where she stands with Mordecai. Maybe it's simpler than that. Just the plain, unbearable vulnerability of hearing someone describe a certainty she isn't sure she's ever actually had from him. Whatever the exact trigger, she reaches a point where she needs to know, clearly, unambiguously, whether Mordecai considers her his soulmate, and Mordecai, given the floor to answer that question in front of everyone who matters to both of them, fumbles it. He doesn't lie. He doesn't say anything cruel. He simply cannot, in the moment that calls for total clarity, more than any other moment in their entire relationship, produce the certainty she needs to hear. He starts a speech that seems to be heading somewhere, honest, and gets no further than a sentence or two about not being sure who his soulmate is before CJ, heard in a way that reads as final rather than explosive this time, cuts him off, hands back the charm bracelet that had marked the start of their relationship, and walks out. There is a particular kind of internet discourse this scene produces, distinct from the storm at the party discourse, and it is worth naming because it complicates the simple version of CJ is the difficult one that gets repeated the most. A meaningful portion of the fandom looks at this exact scene and does not see a volatile girlfriend overreacting to a wedding speech. They see a boyfriend who, given a direct and reasonable question at the one moment in the entire series when a direct answer mattered most, could not give her one. Fan discussion threads built specifically around this scene have framed it, bluntly, as one of Mordecai's lowest moments in the whole show, not because he did anything monstrous, but because he did something quietly, familiarly cowardly. He let ambiguity stand in for honesty at the exact instant honesty was being requested of him. CJ's exit in that reading is not a tantrum. It's the most controlled thing she does in the entire series. No storm, no lightning, just a returned bracelet and a door. What actually happens after that is, in its own way, one of the more mature beats in the whole show. They talk. Off to the side, away from the reception, the two of them have the conversation that should have happened before either of them ever stood up in front of a room full of people, and they agree, without more shouting, without another storm, to take a break. It is genuinely one of the more adult breakups in the entire series, closer to how people who still respect each other actually end things than the show's usual register of cosmic catastrophe standing in for emotional stakes. And it's telling, maybe, that this quiet, dignified, mutually agreed upon ending is not the beat fans remember when they argue about her. They remember the storm at the party. They remember the tantrums when they come. They tend not to remember that when the relationship finally actually ended, it ended with both of them behaving like adults, and that the person who set the tone for that ending, who chose clarity and calm over one more explosion, was her. A break, though, is not the end of the story, and it's worth going one layer further, because what CJ does with the months that follow tells you almost as much about her as anything that happened while she was still dating Mordecai. There's a smaller, quieter episode called I See Turtles that almost never comes up in the arguments about her, and it might be the single most revealing thing the show ever lets her do. By this point, CJ has every reason in the world to hold a grudge against Margaret. Margaret is, after all, the other side of the near miss at Christmas, the person whose kiss with Mordecai started the slow unraveling that eventually put CJ at that altar with a returned bracelet in her hand. If the show wanted to write her as simply difficult, simply prone to holding on to anger, this is exactly the relationship where that anger would have been not just understandable, but earned. Instead, when a situation comes up involving sea turtles that Eileen cares about, and Margaret happens to be the person best positioned to help, CJ picks up the phone. She reaches out to the woman who, in a less generous version of this character, she would have every reason to freeze out forever, and the two of them work together competently, without incident, to solve the actual problem in front of them. The grudge, whatever was left of it, gets set down. Not because the show forces a big reconciliation scene where they hug it out and declare themselves friends. Just because CJ, when it mattered, chose the practical, generous option over the satisfying one. That's not the behavior of a character built purely to be difficult. That's the behavior of someone who has genuinely worked through something off screen in the space between episodes, the way real people quietly work through things without ever narrating the process out loud. It's worth naming, at this point, the argument that a meaningful slice of CJ's defenders have been making for years now, because it goes further than simply cataloging her good moments against her bad ones. The argument is about double standards, and it's sharper than it sounds at first pass. Benson, the gumball machine who manages the park, is a character built almost entirely around explosive, frequent, often disproportionate anger. He screams at his employees constantly over things that rarely warrant screaming, and the show has structured an enormous amount of its comedy around exactly that explosiveness for its entire run. Nobody calls Benson's characterization lazy. Nobody builds Tumblr tags around whether Benson is secretly the worst person in the cast. His temper is treated, almost uniformly, as a running joke, an endearing flaw, evidence of a stressed middle manager doing an impossible job, not as a referendum on his fitness to be liked. CJ's temper, by contrast, is treated by a significant portion of the audience as evidence of something closer to instability. Same show, same basic mechanism, a character whose stress response is anger that affects the people around her. Different verdict. Fans who've made this argument in long-form essays and forum posts over the years point to a handful of things sitting underneath that gap. Some of it is the literal stakes of her anger versus his, since Benson yells and CJ generates actual weather, and it's fair to say that gap in consequence is real and worth accounting for rather than waving away entirely. But defenders of this reading push further, arguing that some of the disparity has less to do with the size of the reaction and more to do with who's having it. A girlfriend who gets intensely upset reads, to a lot of viewers, differently than a boss who gets intensely upset, even when the underlying behavior rhymes closely enough to invite the comparison. One gets filed under management stress. The other gets filed under red flag. That's an interpretation rather than something the show states outright, and it's one that not everyone in the fandom accepts. But it's a serious enough argument, made by enough people independently, that it deserves to be part of any honest accounting of why she's the one character from this show people still can't agree on. There's a related thread of criticism worth being honest about too, because pretending the case against her is entirely manufactured would be its own kind of distortion. Some fans have pushed back on CJ for reasons that have nothing to do with her behavior at all, and everything to do with a simple, blunt sense that she isn't Margaret, that she disrupted a pairing certain viewers had already decided they wanted, and that her presence in the story reads, to those viewers, as an obstacle rather than a person. That version of the criticism is worth naming honestly as weaker than the others. It has less to do with anything CJ actually does on screen and more to do with the very common, very human habit of resenting whoever arrives second in a love triangle, regardless of what she brings with her. There's also a stranger, smaller pocket of criticism aimed at the fact that she and Mordecai are, technically, different species, a bird and a cloud, which is a criticism that mostly says more about the person making it than about the character being discussed, given how thoroughly the show's entire cast crosses exactly that kind of boundary without comment in every other relationship it depicts. Underneath all of this sits the voice that actually carries CJ across every one of these episodes, and it's worth pausing on the fact of who that voice belongs to, because it's easy to forget, watching a cartoon, that every one of these emotional beats was built by a real performer making specific, deliberate choices about tone. CJ is voiced by Linda Cardellini, an actress who has spent most of her career in live-action work, in dramas and prestige television, bringing a specific kind of grounded, lived-in naturalism to roles far removed from Saturday morning animation. That background shows up in the performance in a way that's easy to miss if you're not listening for it. CJ never sounds like a cartoon villain having a tantrum. She sounds, even at her angriest, like an actual person losing her composure, which is a much harder note to hit and a much more uncomfortable one to sit with, because it refuses to let the audience file her anger away as simple comic exaggeration. When she's hurt, she sounds hurt first, in a register that a lesser performance would have skipped past on the way to the yelling. That choice, made take after take across years of episodes, is a big part of why this character produces genuine disagreement instead of a simple, easy dislike. A worse performance would have made her easy to write off. Cardellini's performance never quite lets you, which brings us to the deepest layer, the one that most viewers never actually see, because it doesn't live inside an episode at all. It lives in the space after the show stopped telling her story, and in a handful of sentences, a creator dropped, almost in passing, when someone asked him what happened to her. Regular Show ends the way very few animated comedies of its era were willing to end, with a real-time skip, years forward, showing its characters as adults with actual lives, instead of freezing them in the same permanent, unaging present the genre usually prefers. Mordecai, in that future, is a working painter, and one of the pieces the show lingers on, in its final stretch, is an abstract work that clearly, deliberately, incorporates both Margaret and CJ, folded into the same canvas, two shapes that mattered enough to end up in the same finished thing. It's a lovely, generous choice on the page. It tells you that neither woman was erased from who he became, that both of them are somewhere in the artist he grew into, whether or not either of them ended up standing next to him in the literal domestic sense. But Mordecai does not end up with either of them. In the future, the show actually shows you he's married to a bat named Steph, a character the audience has never met before that moment, who appears with almost no setup and almost no explanation. They're simply because the show has decided, quietly and without fanfare, that the person you spend your 20s agonizing over is not always the person you end up building a life with. That choice produced its own separate wave of debate, a different discourse from the one surrounding CJ specifically, about whether it was wise or hollow to hand the protagonist's ending to someone the audience had no relationship with at all. We're not going to go all the way down that particular hallway tonight. It belongs to Mordecai's story more than hers. But it matters here because of what it means for CJ specifically. She doesn't get a version of that ending. She doesn't get a Steph. She doesn't get a domestic afterward on screen at all. The show simply stops telling you where she went. That gap is where the last, quietest piece of controversy around her actually lives, and it comes from outside the show itself, from something closer to folklore than canon. In commentary given after the series wrapped, the creator has described, in passing, what became of CJ in the years the show never had time to depict. She went on to become a professional dodgeball player, chasing the one thing we'd already seen her be genuinely, unambiguously excellent at, all the way back in the early seasons when she still had time to be simply good at something without it being weighed down by everything that came later. And, according to that same offhand account, she stopped speaking to all of them. Not just Mordecai, all of them. Rigby, Eileen, Margaret, the whole circle of people who had for a few years been as close to her as anyone in her life. Whatever bridges survived the breakup itself, whatever generosity carried her through helping Margaret with the turtles, whatever friendship she and Eileen had built independent of who either of them was dating, all of it, apparently, eventually went quiet. It is worth being careful here about what kind of fact this is. It isn't animated on screen. It isn't dramatized in an episode the way Rigby's graduation, or Muscle Man's mourning, or Skips's centuries of grief are dramatized. It's a detail from creator commentary, offered outside the text, the kind of thing that carries real weight, because it comes from the person who built her, but that also sits in a slightly different category than the events the show actually chose to show you. Label it, honestly, as reported creator commentary rather than something the finale itself puts on the screen. But even held at that careful distance, it lands with an unusual amount of weight because of what it implies about the story the show was telling about her all along without ever quite saying it out loud. A woman who was honest from the very first conversation she ever had with this cast, who forgave a near betrayal at Christmas, who called a rival with no hesitation when a friend needed help, who ended her own relationship with more composure than the man she was leaving showed her, ends up in the version of her life the show only gestures at rather than shows, entirely alone, doing the one thing she was always best at, talking to no one who used to matter to her. That is not a happy ending. It isn't framed in the commentary as a tragedy either, not explicitly, but it is very hard to hear it described that plainly. A professional athlete who cut every old tie and not feel the weight of what it isn't being said. Something in that ending reads like exhaustion. Something in it reads like a woman who spent years being patient, generous, and honest with people, who kept giving her reasons not to be, and who eventually, finally, simply stopped trying to be understood by them and went and did the one thing that had never required anyone else's cooperation to be good at. That reading is interpretation, not confirmed text, and it deserves to be held with appropriate humility, since we're extrapolating an emotional interior from a handful of sentences a creator said once, offhand, years after the fact. But it's the interpretation a lot of longtime fans have quietly arrived at on their own, in exactly the kind of forum threads where people go looking for closure the show itself never fully provided. There's a small current footnote worth adding here, since it's fresh enough that most casual viewers of the original series won't know about it yet. In the spring of 2026, Cartoon Network brought the show back in a new form, a series called Regular Show, The Lost Tapes, built around the framing device of Pops, now existing somewhere in the afterlife, following his sacrifice at the end of the original run. Discovering a box of old VHS tapes containing adventures that were never shown the first time around. It's a clever structural choice, since it lets new episodes slot into gaps in the original 8 seasons rather than pretending to continue a story that already found its ending. As of what's publicly documented about the revival, its returning cast centers on Mordecai, Rigby, Benson, Pops, Skips, Muscle Man, and High Five Ghost, the core 7 who carried the original show's premise from the very first episode. Whether CJ appears anywhere in it isn't something that's been clearly confirmed one way or the other in what's publicly available right now, and it would be dishonest to claim certainty either direction. What can be said honestly is only this. The show has been given a door back into its own past, a way to revisit moments it never had time for the first time around, and whether that door ever opens onto CJ, whether the audience gets a chance to sit with her again outside the shape the finale left her in, is simply not something anyone outside the writer's room knows yet. It's worth stepping back now, all the way back, further than any single episode, and looking at the shape of the argument itself, rather than the character sitting at the center of it, because the CJ or Margaret debate that's followed this show around for over a decade is, in its own way, just as revealing as anything that happens inside the episodes. Go looking for it, and you'll find it everywhere the fandom gathers, forum threads with titles that pose the question as a straightforward binary, video essays with names like CJ deserved better, long-running comment sections under any clip of the two of them together, where people are still, years after the finale aired, litigating who Mordecai should have ended up with, as though the outcome were still somehow undecided. It is decided. It's been decided since January of 2017. And yet the argument keeps happening, which tells you the argument was never really about plot resolution in the first place. What it's actually about, most of the time, is a question the show itself keeps asking in a dozen different ways without ever answering outright. What does a person deserve in a relationship, and what does it cost to ask for it? Margaret represents, in the shorthand the fandom has built around her over the years, steadiness, ambition, a life with a clear shape and a clear direction, the kind of partner who is easy to imagine building a stable future alongside. CJ represents something harder to categorize, someone whose feelings are bigger and less convenient, whose love comes without the polish, whose presence in the story keeps forcing Mordecai to be honest before he's ready to be. Fans who prefer Margaret are often, whether they'd put it this way or not, expressing a preference for the version of love that asks less of you. Fans who prefer CJ are often expressing something closer to an instinct that love which asks nothing of you was never really testing you at all, and that the version of Mordecai the show actually needed to become could only have been built by someone willing to demand honesty from him, loudly, repeatedly, at real cost to herself. Neither preference is wrong exactly. They're both real readings of what the show is doing with its two central romantic options, and the fact that a fandom this size has spent over a decade unable to fully settle the question says less about a failure of the writing and more about how successfully the show built two entirely different, entirely legitimate versions of what a life with Mordecai might have looked like. But it's worth noticing, honestly, which of those two women ends up absorbing the harsher judgment for the exact same underlying behavior. Margaret leaves for journalism school in the middle of the series, pursuing her own ambitions independent of Mordecai's feelings about it, and the show, and the fandom along with it, treats that departure as one of her more admirable, mature choices, a sign of a fully realized woman with a life of her own. CJ, choosing honesty over silence, choosing to name a hurt rather than swallow it, gets filed by a real slice of that same audience, under difficult, under unstable, under the reason things didn't work out. Both women, in their own register, were simply refusing to shrink themselves to fit around a boy who wasn't ready for either of them. Only one of them gets remembered as the reasonable one for it. This is, I think, the place where the conversation about CJ stops being only about regular show and starts being about something a good deal larger, a pattern that shows up across an enormous amount of the television and film built for general audiences over the last several decades, and it deserves to be named carefully as an interpretation rather than a proven law, because it's the kind of claim that's easy to overstate. But the pattern is real enough that it's been written about, argued about, and pushed back on in genuinely thoughtful ways by people paying close attention to how stories treat women who feel things loudly. A man who explodes gets read over and over across an enormous range of stories, as passionate, as intense, sometimes even as a kind of proof of how deeply he cares. Benson's temper in this very show gets exactly that treatment, softened by the framing into something almost lovable, evidence of a man who cares too much about a job that keeps failing him. A woman who explodes, feeling the same underlying thing, expressing it with the same underlying intensity, more often gets read as a problem to be solved, a warning sign, a reason to be cautious, even when the story around her is doing everything it can, in its own quiet way, to make the case for sympathy. CJ, with her literal weather, her actual physical consequences, makes an unusually vivid test case for that pattern, because the show gave her powers dramatic enough that the disparity in how audiences receive her anger becomes almost impossible to miss once you're looking for it. None of this means every criticism of CJ is secretly, underneath it, an expression of that larger pattern. Some of the criticism is straightforwardly earned, a person, cartoon or otherwise, whose anger puts other people in physical danger has crossed a line that simple hurt feelings don't excuse, and pretending otherwise would flatten her into something less interesting and less honest than what the show actually built. The most useful way to hold this, probably, is not to pick a single verdict and defend it to the end, but to let both things be true at once, the way the show itself seems to, more often than it gets credit for. CJ hurt people when she lost control. CJ was also, consistently, across nearly every episode she appears in, more honest, more generous, and more willing to name hard truths than almost anyone else in her orbit, including, especially, the boy she loved. A worse show would have picked one of those and stuck to it. Regular show, whatever its flaws, mostly let her be both and left it to the audience to decide what to do with the discomfort of that. That discomfort, in the end, is probably the whole reason we're still talking about her. Controversial does not mean poorly made. Sometimes it means the opposite. A character built with just enough contradiction, just enough unresolved tension between what she does and why she does it, that no single tidy verdict ever quite closes the file. The easy characters get forgotten. The ones people still argue about, years after the last episode aired, are usually the ones the writers refuse to make easy in the first place. Let's go back now and look more closely at a few of these moments than we did the first time through, because summarizing an episode and actually sitting inside it are two different experiences, and the difference matters if you want to understand why these scenes produced the specific reactions they produced rather than some other reaction entirely. Start with the Christmas kiss, because it's the hinge the whole relationship eventually turns on, and it deserves to be looked at more slowly than a single sentence allows. Picture the setting the show actually gives you. String lights, the particular hush of a park at night in winter, snow catching what little light there is and throwing it back pale and blue. Margaret and Mordecai end up alone together in that hush, the way people who have almost said something to each other for years eventually do, given enough proximity and enough silence to fill. And CJ finds them mid-kiss, not through gossip, not through suspicion, but by simple, rotten bad luck walking into a moment that was never meant to have a witness. There's no shouting in that instant. The show doesn't give her a scream or an instant transformation. It gives her stillness first, the particular kind of stillness that happens in the half second before a person's face decides what it's going to do next, and only after that stillness does the hurt start to show. That's a deliberate choice on the part of the animators and the writers, whether or not any single interview ever confirms it outright, because a hurt that arrives instantly, reflexively, reads differently on screen than a hurt that arrives with that pause built into it. The pause is the show quietly asking you to imagine what's happening behind her eyes in that half second before it lets you see what she does with it. Or take the storm at the golf cart party and look past the wind and the lightning to the smaller details sitting inside the chaos, the paper decorations torn loose and spinning, the punch bowl overturned, the particular human comedy of a park full of people who have clearly lived through enough of these events by now that half of them are already reaching for cover before the first gust even hits. The show trusting its audience to understand, without a line of dialogue explaining it, that this is not the first time CJ's temper has reshaped a room. That detail, the practiced, weary way the other characters react, tells you something the plot never states outright. This has happened before, more than once, off screen, in the gaps between episodes, and the community around her has already, quietly, built its own coping mechanisms for it. That's not a flattering detail for CJ, and it shouldn't be softened into one. It's evidence that whatever sympathy her backstory earns her, the people who actually have to stand in the same room as her anger have learned, the hard way, to treat it as a weather pattern rather than a person, ducking for cover rather than asking what's wrong. There's something quietly sad buried in that. A woman whose community has, in its own gentle way, stopped trying to reach her in the moment and started simply managing the aftermath instead. And then the wedding again, the scene we opened with, but slower this time, closer. Picture the room the way the show actually builds it, folding chairs arranged under string lights, not so different from the ones at the Christmas party months earlier, a detail that feels almost too pointed to be accidental, the show quietly rhyming its own imagery across a season the way a careful piece of music rhymes a melody. Muscle Man, someone the show has spent years training you to see as loud, uncomplicated, easy to read, stands at the front of that room, about to marry Starla in what is, by the standards of this cast, one of the more stable, uncomplicated love stories the show ever tells. Their relationship has had its own difficulties across the run, but nothing close to the volatility sitting a few rows back in the audience, where Mordecai and CJ, still technically together, still carrying the unresolved residue of the Christmas almost betrayal, sit next to each other pretending, the way people do at weddings, that everything between them is fine. Then someone stands up to give the soulmates speech, the kind of speech every wedding produces, sincere and a little clumsy, the kind of speech nobody in the room is expected to take as a personal referendum on their own relationship. Except CJ does take it that way, and watching the scene closely, it's hard to read that as an overreaction, rather than as the completely predictable result of months of small, accumulated uncertainty finally reaching the one setting built specifically to ask the question out loud. A wedding is where the culture keeps its clearest, loudest statement about what certainty is supposed to look like. Sitting inside one, next to a boyfriend she's never quite been sure of, hearing a stranger describe the exact confidence she doesn't have, is close to the worst possible place for that particular doubt to surface. The show does not soften the setting to make her reaction feel smaller. If anything, it built the entire wedding specifically to make the question unavoidable, and Mordecai's fumble, looked at closely rather than summarized, is almost more painful in its ordinariness than in its cruelty. He doesn't say anything designed to wound her. He simply cannot access, under pressure, in front of a room full of people, the plain sentence that would have ended the whole crisis in one breath. That failure, small and human, and achingly familiar to anyone who has ever frozen at the exact moment clarity was needed most, is the show's real subject in that scene, more than CJ's reaction to it. She doesn't storm. She doesn't turn gray. She takes off a bracelet and leaves, which held up against every other conflict in this relationship, is the single calmest, most self-possessed thing she does in the entire series, arriving at the exact moment the fandom has spent years citing as proof of her instability. The scene people point to as evidence of how difficult she was is, examined slowly rather than summarized quickly, the scene where she is, by a wide margin, the most composed person in the room. There's a broader thread worth pulling here before we start heading toward the end of this, because it connects CJ back to something the show is doing across its entire runtime, something bigger than any one relationship. Regular show, underneath its cosmic monsters and its video game tournaments, keeps circling back, episode after episode, season after season, to a single quiet question about what it costs to tell someone the truth and what it costs not to. Mordecai's whole arc, stretched across 8 seasons, is largely the story of a young man slowly, painfully, learning to say the true thing before the situation forces it out of him instead. Rigby's arc is a parallel version of the same lesson, learned even more slowly at even greater cost to the people around him. And CJ, more than any other character in the cast, is positioned again and again as the person standing at the far end of that lesson already, the one who says the true thing first, immediately, sometimes at real cost to her own composure, while the people she loves are still working up the nerve to catch up to her. That positioning is, I think, the real, deepest reason she generates the reaction she generates. A story that keeps rewarding delayed honesty in its male leads, giving them years of runway to grow into the plain-spokenness CJ arrives with on day one, is always going to produce some friction around the character who's already there, who doesn't get a redemption arc for learning to speak plainly because she never needed one. Growth is satisfying to watch. Presence, the simple, unglamorous fact of someone who was already doing the hard thing before the story started rewarding it, is harder to appreciate in the moment and easier later to misread as excess, as too much, as more than the story or the audience quite knew what to do with. There's another layer underneath even that one, and it has less to do with what happens inside the show and more to do with why a cartoon aimed, at least on a paper, at a general audience was willing to build a character this uncomfortable in the first place. It's worth remembering what kind of show this actually was for most of its runtime, a comedy about 2 groundskeepers avoiding work, structured around jokes that could air comfortably in a Saturday morning lineup, filled with the kind of low-stakes slacker humor that doesn't usually leave much room for a girlfriend whose anger comes with real, physical consequences, and whose backstory involves a father who taught her that failing to hold herself together was itself a kind of failure. Most shows built for that audience in that era would have kept a character like this at arm's length, softened into a punchline, her anger played strictly for laughs, with none of the weight daddy issues or the Christmas kiss ever gives it. Regular show, instead, kept choosing to let both things sit in the same scene at once, the joke and the wound, the destruction and the reason behind it, refusing to pick a single tone and stay inside it. That refusal is, in its own quiet way, a kind of respect. It would have been easier, structurally, to write CJ as simply unstable and let the audience laugh at her without asking any harder questions. The show never quite let itself take that shortcut, even when doing so might have made her easier to like. That choice produced real cost, the kind of cost you can trace directly in the years of forum arguments and video essays this single character has generated because audiences, especially audiences trained by a decade of tidier storytelling, generally prefer their characters to resolve cleanly into hero or obstacle, sympathetic or cautionary, rather than sitting permanently in the harder, less comfortable middle. CJ never fully resolves. She's still, right now, tonight, generating exactly the kind of divided reaction she generated the week, dumped at the altar, first aired, which is either a mark of failure if you think good writing is supposed to settle these questions for you, or a mark of something closer to success. If you think the more interesting achievement is building a character real enough that the argument about her never quite finishes. It's worth naming, too, the quieter audience this kind of character reaches, the viewers who don't show up in the loudest threads, but who've said, in smaller, more private corners of the fandom, that CJ was the character who felt most like watching a piece of their own life play out on screen. Not the volatile parts necessarily, though for some viewers, honestly, that recognition runs that deep too. People who grew up learning, the way CJ did, that a parent's love came wrapped in conditions and competition, and who found something almost startling in watching a cartoon character work through that exact wound in front of them. But more often, the recognition lands somewhere smaller and more common than that. The experience of being the one in a relationship who says the hard thing first, who names the problem before the other person is ready to hear it, and who gets, for that honesty, some version of the label CJ ended up carrying. Difficult, too much, hard to be with. There is a particular quiet kind of comfort for a viewer who has lived that exact dynamic in watching a show at least try to make the case for the person usually cast as the difficult one, even if the show doesn't fully win that case, even if a meaningful slice of the audience still doesn't buy it. Being taken seriously by the text, even partially, even imperfectly, is not nothing. If you've spent your own life rarely getting that treatment from the people around you, none of this is offered as a final verdict, because a final verdict isn't really available here, and reaching for one would flatten exactly the quality that makes this character worth spending this much time with in the first place. What's available instead is a fuller picture than the one that usually gets passed around, the tantrums and thunderclouds shorthand that circulates in casual conversation about the show, stripped of the honesty in yes, dude, yes, the forgiveness in sad sex, the earned respect in daddy issues, the generosity in I see turtles, the composure at the altar that gets remembered backward as the opposite of composure. Hold all of it at once. The destructive party alongside the returned bracelet, the near betrayal she forgave alongside the storm that genuinely endangered people who didn't deserve it, and you end up somewhere more honest than either side of the online argument usually lands. Not a villain, not a saint, someone the show built with enough contradiction, enough real weight on both sides of the scale, that 10 years on, people are still standing in the comment sections, still arguing, still unable to look away from a cloud-shaped girl who loved a bird who could never quite say the thing she needed him to say at the exact moment she needed to hear it. There's a layer here, too, that only comes into focus if you stop watching CJ in isolation and start watching how the people around her actually treat her, because a character's reputation inside the world of a story is never built by that character alone. It's built by how everyone else responds to her, and regular show is surprisingly consistent once you're looking for it in how it stages that response. Take Skips, the park's oldest and steadiest presence, the one character in the entire cast who has genuinely seen everything the park has to offer and rarely reacts to any of it with anything more than mild, weathered patience. He's the one who ends up, more than once, quietly fixing whatever CJ's storms leave broken, replacing a fence post here, patching a roof there, and the show never gives him a single line of judgment about it. No lecture, no exasperated aside to Mordecai about the girlfriend situation. He just repairs the damage and moves on, the way he handles every other disaster that blows through the park on a given week, cosmic or otherwise. It's a small detail, easy to miss, but it tells you something about how the show itself, at the level of its most level-headed character, actually files CJ's outbursts. As one more strange thing that happens at this particular park, not fundamentally different in kind from the other impossible things Skips has spent years quietly cleaning up after. The park has survived worse. The park will survive this too. That's not absolution exactly, but it's a meaningful data point about how much weight the show itself wants you to put on the destruction, and the answer, filtered through its most trustworthy character, seems to be less than the loudest corners of the fandom eventually put on it. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost, for their part, mostly treat CJ the way they treat everyone else in Mordecai's orbit, with a kind of loud, uncomplicated warmth that doesn't seem to be shadowed by any real wariness. She gets invited to the wedding. She gets folded into group outings without any sense that the rest of the cast considers her a risk to be managed. Whatever caution shows up around her, and there is some, especially in scenes immediately following a blow-up, reads less like fear of a dangerous person and more like the specific, practical caution people develop around a friend with a short fuse, the kind of caution you'd extend to anyone you cared about who occasionally needed a minute to cool down. It is worth noticing what's absent here as much as what's present. Nobody in this cast ever suggests, seriously, that Mordecai should be worried, that CJ is someone to be protected from rather than someone worth being patient with. That absence is a choice made consistently across dozens of episodes by writers who could easily have used in any one of these side characters to voice the exact anxieties a chunk of the fandom would go on to voice instead. And then there's Eileen, whose friendship with CJ we touched on earlier, but which deserves a closer look, because it might be the single clearest piece of evidence the show offers about who CJ actually is when nobody's love life is on the line. Eileen is, across the whole series, one of the more perceptive characters in the cast, quiet and observant in a way that lets her notice things other characters miss entirely, and she is also, notably, someone who does not extend her trust cheaply. She spends years being cautious, even guarded, before she'll let herself believe that Rigby's feelings for her are real. She is not a character who befriends people carelessly. And yet her friendship with CJ, once it takes hold, holds. It survives the breakup with Mordecai. It survives whatever residual awkwardness might have lingered from CJ's various eruptions. Two women who could easily have drifted apart once their mutual connection to Mordecai came apart and instead keep showing up for each other. In the smaller, less dramatic episodes, the loud discourse tends to skip past entirely. If Eileen, sharp-eyed and slow to trust, never once treats CJ as someone to be wary of, that's worth weighing seriously against a fandom argument built largely on second-hand impressions of a handful of high-stakes scenes. It's worth asking, too, why any of this is still being argued about at all, nearly a decade after the finale aired, in a media landscape that moves on from most animated sitcoms within a year or two of their last episode. Part of the answer is simply structural. The show lives on streaming platforms now, easy to find, easy to binge in a weekend the way it was never designed to be watched originally, and every new wave of viewers arriving cold, without the years of accumulated fan discourse already shaping how they see the cast, gets to form their own opinion of CJ from scratch, discover the same tension the original audience discovered in real time, and add their own voice to threads that, in some cases, have been quietly running for over a decade. The wiki keeps its pages on her updated. The clip channels keep resurfacing the storm scenes and the altar scene, usually without the surrounding context that makes either of them make sense, which means every new viewer who encounters her first through a 5-minute clip is starting from the least generous possible entry point, the loudest moment stripped of the quieter ones that explain it. And now, with the 2026 revival back on the air, there's a real possibility that a whole new audience is going to meet this cast for the first time, or meet them again after years away, right as the old arguments are already circulating louder than ever in the comment sections underneath every new episode. Whether the lost tapes ever gives CJ another scene, or leaves her exactly where the original series left her, out past the edge of the frame, doing the one thing that never needed anyone's permission to be good at. The conversation around her isn't likely to quiet down anytime soon. Characters built with this much genuine contradiction rarely do quiet down. They just keep getting rediscovered, generation after generation of viewers, each one arriving at the same uncomfortable, unresolved question the last one arrived at, and each one, in their own way, adding one more voice to an argument that was never really designed to be won. It's worth looking, too, at the two bodies the animators actually gave her, because the show tells you almost everything you need to know about how it wants you to feel about CJ, just through the way it chooses to draw her. In her calm state, she is drawn soft. White skin with a faint, cool undertone, a cloud-shaped head that reads, in most lighting, as hair rather than as anything alien, a loose ponytail, a red-orange striped tank top that could belong to anyone lounging around a park on a summer afternoon, brown shorts, black boots planted flat on the ground. Nothing about that design asks you to be wary of her. It's a design built for ease, for the kind of character you're meant to like on sight, comfortable in her own posture, in a way a lot of the show's more anxious characters, Mordecai chief among them, rarely manage. And then something shifts, and the animators do something worth naming specifically because it's a genuinely careful piece of visual storytelling that gets flattened every time someone just says she turns into a storm and moves on. The change doesn't happen all at once. It moves through her the way weather actually moves through a sky, gray creeping into her skin at the edges first, a flush of red underneath it that reads less like anger in the simple cartoon sense and more like something closer to a bruise spreading, the visual language of hurt rather than the visual language of rage. Even in the frames where rage is clearly what's driving the scene, the wind picks up around her before her voice ever does. By the time she's speaking, if she's still speaking at all by that point, the transformation has usually gone further than words can really keep up with, which is its own kind of honest storytelling about what real anger actually feels like from the inside, a thing that outpaces language, that arrives in the body before it arrives in anything you could put in a sentence. That craft choice matters because of what it refuses to do. A show that wanted you to simply be afraid of CJ, that wanted her transformation read purely as monstrous, had an easy, well-worn set of animation tools available to make that reading obvious. Sharp teeth, narrowed eyes, a silhouette built to read as predator rather than as person. Regular show never reaches for those tools with her. Even at her most destructive, she stays recognizably herself, gray and red and windswept rather than fanged and clawed, a person having an enormous feeling rather than a monster wearing a person's shape. That's a genuinely unusual choice for a story built around a girlfriend whose anger causes real property damage, and it's one of the clearest pieces of evidence sitting quietly in the animation itself, rather than in any line of dialogue, that the writers and artists never actually intended her to be read as a villain, no matter how many individual scenes get pulled out of context and used to argue otherwise. Which points at something else worth naming plainly. For all the discourse CJ generates, the show itself never once frames her as an antagonist. Not officially, not structurally, not in the way genre convention usually handles a volatile ex-girlfriend character. There's a very familiar shape. That kind of character often gets pushed into elsewhere in fiction. The scorned, unstable ex, who exists mainly to be feared, to justify the protagonist's eventual, relieved escape into a calmer relationship. A shape built to make the audience root for her exit rather than her happiness. Regular show never builds that shape around CJ. She's never punished by the narrative for her anger the way that trope usually demands. She's never humiliated, never villainized in a season finale, never given a cartoonish comeuppance designed to satisfy an audience that's been trained to want one. The worst thing that ultimately happens to her, as far as the show is willing to tell you, is quieter and sadder than any of that. She simply stops being close to people who mattered to her off screen, without spectacle, in a way that reads less like punishment and more like the ordinary, unglamorous way real relationships actually end when nobody involved is a villain, just imperfect, just human, just occasionally too much for each other to hold on to. One last thing worth sitting with before we go back up to the parking lot for good is how much of this entire story is written in weather and how strange and specific a choice that actually was. Most relationships on television get their emotional temperature conveyed through music cues, through lighting, through the small, standard toolkit every show reaches for when it wants you to feel that something has shifted. Regular show, for this one relationship out of all the relationships it tells across 8 seasons, reached instead for the actual sky. Every major beat in the CJ storyline arrives with its own weather attached, whether or not she's the one generating it. The Christmas kiss happens in snow, hushed and pale and blue, the kind of quiet that makes any sound feel like a betrayal. The masquerade kiss happens indoors, at a party lit warm and gold, weather held at bay for one evening, which is maybe why that particular kiss gets to stay soft instead of becoming something sharper. The golf cart party turns violent under a sky that had been, moments earlier, an ordinary, unremarkable afternoon, the kind of sky nobody thinks to describe, because nothing about it seems to be asking for description right up until it is. And the wedding, the parking lot, the bracelet, all of it happens under a sky that does nothing at all, flat and undramatic and, in its own way, the most unsettling sky in the entire arc, because by that point the show has trained you to expect the weather to answer for her, and it simply declines to. That decision, a sky that stays empty at the exact moment the story had spent years training you to expect it to break open, might be the single most eloquent piece of storytelling in CJ's entire arc, and it never says a word to earn that eloquence. It just withholds. It lets the silence do what the thunder usually does. And if you've been paying attention to weather your whole life, the way some people do, the way people who grew up watching storms roll in over a particular stretch of sky learn to read the color of a cloud, the way other people read a face, that emptiness lands harder than any lightning bolt the show could have thrown at that parking lot. Nothing needed to explode. She had already done the harder thing. She had already stopped needing the sky to speak for her. It's worth pausing, too, on the word sitting right there in the show's own title, because it's easy to stop noticing a word once you've heard it 1,000 times, and this particular word is doing more work than it usually gets credit for. Regular. A regular show about a regular park, staffed by people doing, on paper, a regular job. The joke, for most of the series, is the gap between that word and what actually happens inside it. Groundskeeping interrupted every week by something cosmic and absurd. The ordinary constantly cracking open to reveal something enormous underneath. That's the show's whole engine for 8 seasons, running on video game villains and demon keyboards and space wars, each one a wildly irregular thing wearing the word regular like a disguise. CJ's story runs on a quieter version of exactly that same joke, except nothing about it is funny by the time you reach the bottom of it. On the surface, hers is the most regular story in the entire show. A guy meets a girl through a dating profile his friend filled out badly. They like the same music. They date for a while. They fight sometimes, the way people fight. He's not ready for her in one moment when she needs him to be. And it ends, quietly, in a parking lot, the way an enormous number of real relationships in an enormous number of real people's 20s actually end, without a villain, without a clean lesson, just two people who loved each other honestly and still couldn't make the timing work. There's no cosmic warlord anywhere in that story. No stakes bigger than two hearts and a bracelet. And it might, when you hold it up against everything else this show ever attempted, be the single most irregular thing regular show ever did, precisely because of how regular it insisted on staying, how flatly it refused to dress the heartbreak up in anything bigger than what it actually was. That refusal is, I think, the real reason this character keeps generating the reaction she generates more than the storms, more than the altar scene, more than any single plot beat you could point to. A cosmic villain is easy to have an opinion about. You root against it, the story resolves, everyone moves on. A woman who loved honestly, got hurt honestly, and reacted the way an enormous number of real people actually react when honesty keeps getting met with hesitation, offers no such easy resolution. She just sits there in the memory of everyone who watched her story unfold, refusing to resolve into hero or cautionary tale, because real heartbreak generally refuses that resolution too. The show gave its silliest, most video game obsessed, least emotionally literate characters a genuinely regular heartbreak to sit inside and then decline to tell you how to feel about it. 10 years on, viewers are still doing that work themselves, one comment section at a time, because the show never did it for them. That's not a flaw. It might be the most honest thing regular show ever did with its runtime, tucked inside a subplot that a lot of viewers, watching quickly, watching casually, watching for the jokes and the monsters and the video game tournaments, could be forgiven for underestimating entirely. Go back and watch it slowly, the way we've been watching it tonight, and it stops looking like a subplot at all. It starts looking like the quiet, aching center the rest of the show's noise was always built around. It's worth asking, honestly, what the word controversial is even doing here, because it's a word usually reserved for things with a clear moral fault line running through them, a character who did something the audience can point to and argue was right or wrong in some larger, more consequential sense. CJ never did anything that dramatic. Nobody died because of her. No friendship was permanently destroyed. No crime committed. No irreversible harm done that the show couldn't gently repair by the following episode. And yet the word keeps attaching itself to her anyway, more consistently than it attaches to characters who did objectively larger things across the series, which tells you the word is being used a little differently here than its dictionary definition would suggest. What people actually mean most of the time when they call CJ controversial is that she made them feel something they didn't fully want to feel. Recognition mixed with discomfort, sympathy mixed with a flicker of judgment they weren't entirely proud of once they noticed it in themselves. That's a different, harder kind of controversy than the usual villain or hero kind. It's the kind that implicates the audience a little, asks them to examine their own reflexes, rather than simply their opinion of a cartoon character, and those are always the controversies that last the longest, because there's no tidy way to resolve a disagreement that's secretly about the people having it. If you've ever been the one in a relationship who said the hard thing first and watched it get filed away as difficult rather than honest, you already understood everything this video has been building toward long before we got here. If you've ever been the one who couldn't get the words out in time, who stood at your own version of that altar and let ambiguity stand in for an answer. Somebody deserved. You probably understood the other half of it just as clearly. Regular Show, in its own strange storm cloud shaped way, built a mirror for both of those experiences and hung it in the middle of a cartoon about a park nobody expected to still be watching a decade later. That the mirror still catches people off guard, still generates arguments in comment sections at 2 in the morning, still sends viewers back to rewatch a handful of episodes just to check whether they remembered them fairly, is probably the clearest evidence available that the writers built something true. Not comfortable, not neatly resolved. True in the specific, inconvenient way that only the best, most regular heartbreaks ever manage to be. There's one more layer worth going down into before we head back up to where we started, and it has nothing to do with the storms at all. It has to do with the parts of CJ that had nothing to prove, nothing to defend, nothing riding on them except the simple fact of being good at something. Go back to that early courtship stretch, the New Year's kiss through Real Date run of episodes, and watch it again with an eye specifically for what CJ does when nobody in the scene is upset with her. At the masquerade party, half her face hidden behind a mask that barely disguises her at all, she's the one who suggests the game they end up playing, some small, invented contest between the two of them, the kind of thing people do at parties when they're testing whether they like spending time with someone more than they like performing for a room. She wins, casually, without making a show of it, the way people win things they've simply had more practice at than everyone around them. There's an ease to her in these episodes that gets almost entirely erased from the character once the fandom discourse settles around her, an ease built out of specific, demonstrated competence rather than general cartoon confidence. She rides a motorcycle with the kind of unstudied comfort that suggests she's been riding it since long before the show ever put a camera on her. She plays for a dodgeball team, the Thunder Girls, at a level serious enough that the show treats her performance on the court as a real, earned skill rather than a background joke. She grew up around competitive miniature golf, trained hard enough and long enough by a demanding father that by the time she faces him again as an adult in daddy issues, she has more than enough game to beat him outright, not through a lucky break or a plot contrivance, but because she is, plainly, better than he expected her to still be. Put all of that together, and a version of CJ starts to come into focus that almost never makes it into the debates about her, a woman who is simply, straightforwardly excellent at a handful of specific things, who found, in sport and in speed and in the particular clean satisfaction of a game, with clear rules and a clear winner, a kind of stability that her emotional life never quite offered her. It's worth wondering, gently, and this is interpretation rather than anything the show confirms outright, whether that's part of why the creator's offhand comment about her later life lands the way it does. A woman who becomes a professional dodgeball player rather than settling into any of the domestic outcomes the rest of the cast gets handed in the finale's time skip. Painting for Mordecai. A family for Rigby and Eileen. A quiet, ordinary marriage for High Five Ghost. CJ gets a court and a ball and a team, and apparently very little else. which reads less like a punishment the writers handed her and more like the plainest, most honest continuation of a pattern that was visible all along if you were watching for it instead of watching for the next storm. She was always most herself, most steady, most unmistakably good in exactly the kind of contest where the rules were clear and the outcome depended only on her. There's a small, sharp sadness sitting underneath that observation, the kind that's easy to walk past if you're not looking for it. A person who is that competent, that composed, that genuinely skilled across 3 or 4 completely different arenas of her life, and who still, somehow, ends up remembered by a large slice of the audience, primarily for the moments she lost control, is a person the story never quite managed to let win on her own terms in the one arena that actually mattered to her most. She could beat her father at his own game. She could outride, outthrow, outcompete nearly everyone she was ever put up against. The one contest she never got to win outright, the one where the stakes were a straight, plain answer to a straight, plain question, is the one the fandom remembers her for losing. Picture it the way the show actually leaves it, once the reception noise fades behind her and the door swings shut. No rain, no wind, just a girl standing under a sky that, for once, isn't doing anything at all, holding a charm bracelet that used to mean something specific and now just means the shape of a thing that ended. Somewhere behind her, through the door, the party keeps going, because parties do that, because Muscle Man and Starla get to have their wedding regardless of what's falling apart a few tables over, because life in this show, as in the actual one, rarely pauses just because someone's heart is breaking in the next room. Somewhere inside, Mordecai is probably still standing where she left him, replaying the 2 sentences he managed to get out before she cut him off, understanding, maybe for the first time with real clarity, what it costs to almost say the true thing instead of actually saying it. And CJ just stands there, calm, dry, entirely herself, in a moment the show could easily have used as an excuse for one more spectacular display of weather, one more storm to punctuate the breakup with the kind of visual drama the character is best known for. It doesn't. It lets her leave quietly instead, which might be the single most pointed choice the writers make about her in the entire series, because it's the one moment they had every narrative permission to make loud and chose, instead, to make still. That stillness is worth sitting with a little longer before we let this go, because it's easy, telling a story like this one, to get pulled toward the version that resolves things neatly. CJ redeemed, CJ vindicated, the fandom simply wrong about her all along. That version would be tidier. It wouldn't be entirely honest. The destruction at the golf cart party happened. The fear on the faces of people caught in that storm, the practiced way the whole park had learned to duck for cover before the first gust even landed, that happened too, and it shouldn't be argued away just because the character responsible for it also happens to be sympathetic, also happens to have real reasons underneath the behavior, also happens to have been let down first, more than once, by the person she was angriest at. Both things are simply true, sitting next to each other, the way they sit next to each other in most real people, the harm and the reason for it, refusing to cancel each other out, just because one of them is more comfortable to hold on to than the other. Maybe that's the actual final shape of what makes her the most controversial person to ever walk through this park. Not that she did something unforgivable, not that the fandom simply misjudged a woman who never deserved a second thought about her. Somewhere in between those two positions, in the harder, less satisfying middle, where most real contradictions actually live, is a character who was honest before anyone asked her to be, hurt worse than she was ever fully compensated for, capable of real damage when that hurt went unaddressed long enough, and generous enough in the end to leave quietly rather than burn the whole wedding down on her way out the door. You can hold all of that as controversy. You can also, if you sit with it long enough, hold it as something closer to a portrait, unflattering in places, tender in others, of what it actually looks like to love someone who keeps almost being ready for you and never quite arriving. The park, in the version the show leaves you with, keeps going after that night, the way parks do. Muscleman and Starla stay married. Mordecai spends the following seasons slowly, awkwardly, becoming someone a little more capable of saying the true thing on the first try instead of the third. And somewhere out past the edges of what the show actually chose to show you, CJ, by the account we have of it, ends up on a dodgeball court somewhere, doing the one thing that never needed anyone else's honesty to be good at, talking to fewer and fewer of the people who once mattered to her, carrying whatever she carried out of that parking lot into a life the cameras never followed her into. If that ending sits a little heavier than it should for a side character in a cartoon about a raccoon and a blue jay, that's probably worth trusting. Some characters get written well enough that the unfairness of their ending stops feeling like fiction and starts feeling like something closer to a fact you're simply going to have to live with. That's the whole shape of it in the end. Not a verdict. A weather system that never fully passed, still moving somewhere else, out past the edge of the map the show was willing to draw, and a fandom that's been standing outside for 10 years now, arguing about whether to call it a storm or just call it what it probably always was underneath the lightning. Someone who loved as hard and as honestly as anyone in this whole show ever did, and who paid for that honesty in a currency almost nobody around her, on screen or off, ever quite figured out how to repay. If you made it all the way down here with me tonight, thank you for staying. If you're still awake, if you're one of the ones who watches these things stretched out somewhere, with the lights already off, I hope some part of this settled in the same slow, unhurried way it was meant to. If you found something in this that you hadn't quite put words to before, about CJ, about this show, about the particular unfairness of being the one who tells the truth first, let me know down in the comments. And if you'd like more of these, more nights like this one spent going all the way down into a single question about a show that clearly mattered to a lot of us, the kindest thing you can do is hit subscribe and maybe leave a like on your way out, quietly, the way CJ left that wedding. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you about as much as she was ever asking anyone for. Just a small, honest gesture offered on your way out the door. Sleep well. I'll see you in the next one.